the stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums. Let's flip back to Bob the person. And in 1965-66, a couple of things happen. Bob marries Rita, his wife. Rita would ultimately become part of Bob's band as a backup singer.
But then they got married in February 1966, just before he went to visit his mother, because Bob's mother had moved to Delaware, to Wilmington.
And so he ended up going, I guess, living with his mother and her new family, and then working in factories in the U.S.
Indeed. Yes, he did, to raise some money, because the objective was to start his own record label so the Wailers could be independent and leave Coxsone. He went off in February 1966.
Next, we will dive with John into the beginnings of Bob Marley's transformation to Rastafarianism. But first, some background on the Rastafari religion and how it came to Jamaica. To do so, we have to go back to the 1920s. Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican who advocated for blacks during that decade. His view, John, was that Jamaicans were former slaves who'd had British and colonial traditions placed on them in terms of culture, religion, and politics, and they deserved to have their own beliefs and structures.
Look, we can only imagine how significant Rastafari would have been for the descendants of people who had endured slavery and who had lived under colonial rule for so very long. Their descendants had been stripped of everything that really makes a human being. Their names, their families, their land, their history, their beliefs, their culture, their futures. They were literally stripped of everything, and they were given a white Christian faith, which didn't sit well with the young rebels of the Wailers era.
And so, way back in the 1920s, as we mentioned, Garvey urged Black Jamaicans to educate themselves and practice self-reliance. He also said that Blacks should look eastward for a Black king, since the Western world had polluted the minds of slaves and stolen their African traditions. This led to a small minority of Jamaican Blacks looking to Ethiopia for hope of a Black king, since Ethiopia had never been colonized by any of the Western European powers. In 1930, Emperor Haile Selassie was crowned in Ethiopia, and for impoverished and social disenfranchised Afro-Jamaicans, this was a sign that the Black king that Marcus Garvey had prophesied had been fulfilled. This small group of Afro-Jamaicans started the Rastafari religion in the 1930s. The name Rastafari actually came from the Ethiopian emperor's original name and title, which was three names: Ras, Tafari, Makanen.
Yeah, he could trace his lineage back to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba.
Wow.
It was that significant.
But from 1930 in colonial Jamaica, Rastafarians were outcasts living in the hills and remote areas and smoking ganja, Jamaican slang for marijuana. Ganja was a sacred sacrament to the Rastafarians. However, a turning point for the small minority of Rastafarians came in the form of a state visit from the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie in 1966 to Jamaica, while Bob was still in the U.S.
But the real action was happening in Jamaica with Rita, Bunny, and Peter, because they witnessed Emperor Haile Selassie's visit. And it had a profound influence on them in Bob's absence.
Bob returns to Jamaica.
He returned to Jamaica, and Peter and Rita and Bunny were full of Selassie's visit. And they began going to Rasta gatherings in Trenchtown. And
so this would have been in the 67, 68 sort of time period that they were in at that point.
That's absolutely correct.
And what's interesting is obviously the appetite for Bob and Peter and Bunny and Rita to really soak up this knowledge really starts to infuse the direction of where, well, certainly Bob heads relative to political activism, knowledge, insight, spirituality.
Yes.
It's really an incredible sort of evolution.
They had a big hit with Lee Perry, with Duppy Conqueror in 1970. They also got together with Perry's backing band, the Upsetters, with the Barrett brothers, the bass player Aston Family Man Barrett and his brother Colton on the drums. The combination of the Wailers' vocal arrangements and the Barrett brothers' rhythm section really gelled, and they actually changed the face of reggae music, because they came up with that very sticky one drop sound, which became a definitive part of reggae music internationally after that.
Next, John will tell us about a key turning point in Bob Marley and the Wailers' ascension to fame. They were signed by Island Records, an international record label headed up by a white Jamaican named Chris Blackwell. Blackwell had his own roots in globally distributing early Jamaican recordings in ska and rocksteady in the 1960s. And under his label, Island, the Wailers began the journey to stardom. So Chris Blackwell steps in, John, and then ultimately finances the first Marley and the Wailers album.
Yes, that's right. That was Catch a Fire. So they went back to Jamaica. They recorded Catch a Fire, and that became their debut album on Island Records.
Catch a Fire, of course, contains the hit Stir It Up.
It's regarded as a classic now, but it really didn't sell too much at the time. But it was a marker. That album was a marker. And what was significant about it was the use of lead guitar overdubs on some of the songs, which really resonated with a rock audience. And that was pivotal. Bob wanted to hear what a rock style lead guitar would sound like. You see, I think the thing to remember is that when you look at Bob Marley at that time, he had long hair. He smoked weed. He liked girls. He was a rebel. He played guitar. He wore denim. I mean, this is that you could be describing a rock star of the early 70s. He fitted that format.
Chris Blackwell saw that persona, I think, and sort of thought this could be the star of this band.
Absolutely. That's who he wanted to spearhead this new form of reggae music, which could appeal to an international audience made up primarily of rock fans at that time.
The next album comes out called Burnin', October 73. Songs, things like Get Up, songs like Get Up, Stand Up, I Shot the Sheriff. Would you say the political elements are being turned up a little bit on this album?
Yeah, and I think that came from confidence. Yeah, this is what they had in them. This is what they had to offer. And Get Up, Stand Up was later adopted by Amnesty International as their anthem. And it was Peter and Bob Marley. They both sang on that record.
I guess we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the Jamaican political situation at that time. You've got a left-leaning government, the CIA rumored to be advocating change to put a pro-business government in. Can you speak a little bit about the political climate that was really having an impact on the people, on the ground in Jamaica?
Yeah, and the Whalers played their part in getting that left wing prime minister elected, Michael Manley. Certainly, there was proven CIA involvement in trying to destabilize Manley's government by the end.
Yeah, they were. I mean, I've read that they were supplying guns to gangs in the streets that sort of were against Manley. Is that fair to say?
It was, and yet the reason why a lot of Rastafarian artists in Jamaica, and not just Bob Marley and Peter Tosh, had a fondness, if you like, or lean towards Michael Manley was because he did things which we don't hear about as often. Free literacy classes all across the island where people who couldn't read and write could go and have lessons and learn to do those things. Women's rights, children's rights. There were a lot of good things happening in Jamaica at that time, but the opposition to Manley and his ambitions was unprecedented, really.
I was going to get into album 5 here, the Natty Dread album.
No, the first thing to say about that album was that it was Bob Marley's first solo album, because Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer had actually left by then. The Wailers' 2-album deal with Island Records had finished, and Chris Blackwell signed Bob Marley essentially as a solo act. But he transposed the name Wailers to his backing musicians, which were still centered around the Barrett brothers.
So how did that go down with Peter Tosh and Bunny Livingston? Like, how did they, or Bunny Wailer, as he ultimately changed his name to, how did that go over that split?
Well, I don't think they liked Chris Blackwell. I think they felt that Chris Blackwell favored Bob Marley. I think they felt that Bob Marley had betrayed them in various ways. But they also had ambitions of being name artists in their own right. And they certainly had the talent to achieve that. And they went on to prove that.
Is there any truth to the fact that Bob Marley went by Bob Marley because he was influenced by Bob Dylan? Or is that just an urban myth?
No, absolutely. I think the influence of Bob Dylan, a lot of Jamaicans wouldn't like to admit that, but his influence on some of those Jamaican artists is unmistakable. I mean, the Wailers themselves covered a couple of Bob Dylan songs when they were at Studio One. So, because he changed the whole notion of songwriting. Even the Beatles were heavily influenced by him. Lyrics with meaning and power and nuance.
Absolutely. We did a recent show on Bob Dylan, and that certainly came through. He changed the game for the Beatles and everyone that followed. Songs with meaning replaced songs about twisting and shouting and the rest of it. So would have had an impact on pretty much globally, as you said.